Amid the raw, unforgiving winter of the Rockies, one man stood between survival and the relentless wolves stalking his camp. But in the dead of night, when all seemed lost, he unveiled a secret trap, a silent sentinel that would change his fate forever. This is the tale of how ingenuity, isolation, and the coldest of winters led to a discovery that no one saw coming. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you're fascinated by frontier survival and the untold stories of the wild, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale promises even more thrilling adventures. The wind howled through the mountain pass, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of the pack. A blizzard had rolled in unexpectedly, burying the forest under a thick blanket of snow. For Samuel Donnelly, the chill in the air wasn't the only threat. He'd seen the wolf tracks earlier that day, deep, wide paw prints, fresh in the snow. They were near. Donnelly had spent 6 long winters in the highlands of the Rockies, trapping and hunting in a land that was both beautiful and brutal. But this winter was different. The wolves had become bolder. The howling that echoed from the cliffs above his camp seemed to taunt him, a reminder of the danger circling just beyond his sight. The small log cabin that served as his home was more than a shelter, it was a lifeline. But every night, the wind brought with it the sound of something moving through the snow, paws crunching softly against the frosted earth. The first few nights had been unnerving, but now, with every passing moment, they grew bolder. They knew he was here. Samuel had spent weeks setting up snares and traps, some for food, others to protect his shelter from larger threats. But the wolves were clever. They didn't fall for the simple snares, and while they avoided his larger traps, there was always the question of when they would grow too curious, too desperate. He stepped outside, into the biting wind, the wooden handle of his axe cold against his palm. The ground was hard, the snow thick, and the moon barely visible through the dense cloud cover. His dog, Wolf, a loyal companion, had been growling at the woods all day. There was no doubt the pack was close. Samuel paused, listening. The wind's howl cut through the silence, but in the distance he heard a faint rustle. His heart quickened. A wolf, its dark eyes glowing in the night, appeared between the trees, a shadow slinking closer. The rest of the pack wasn't far behind. He had to act quickly. His cabin and the snow-covered forest outside were both at risk of being overrun. There was one thing Samuel had learned about wilderness survival: never underestimate your enemy. The wolves were intelligent, relentless, and in the dead of winter, desperate. It wasn't the first time Samuel had encountered wolves in the wilderness. He had survived numerous close calls with animals, far more dangerous than the pack that stalked him now. But something about this winter felt different. Something was off. The wolves seemed to be getting bolder each night, pushing closer to his camp. Back in the old days, his father had taught him how to set traps for larger prey bears, mountain lions, and the like. But now, it was the wolves that threatened his survival. The issue was clear. The traps Samuel had used to catch other animals were too noisy. The wolves, with their sharp instincts, could hear or smell the triggers, and they had learned to avoid them. Samuel spent the next few days making adjustments, working in the quiet solitude of his cabin. He started with the basics: simple snares, tripwires, and pitfalls. But none of these seemed effective. Each morning, he would check his traps, only to find the bait gone and the traps untouched. His frustration mounted. The wolves weren't just a threat to his food, they were a threat to his very existence. If they decided to attack, they could destroy his supplies, tear through his shelter, and leave him with nothing. He had to find a solution, and fast. One evening, after another fruitless day of checking traps, Samuel had an idea. What if he could build something that the wolves couldn't hear or smell? Something that would remain undetected even as it was set in their path. He spent the next few hours working in silence, a plan forming in his mind. His solution wasn't to trap the wolves in the traditional sense. He needed to think differently. Instead of catching them, he would force them into an area where they could be contained. Samuel's mind raced as he envisioned the setup, a network of snares that wouldn't make a sound. Using his knowledge of the terrain, he could position the traps in such a way that they blended seamlessly into the snow. The wolves would never see them coming. By the time the moon reached its peak, Samuel had finished his first silent trap, a series of small, expertly placed snares that used the terrain's natural contours to remain hidden. He felt a strange satisfaction wash over him as he stood back and admired the ingenuity of his work. The snow-covered land now held a secret, one that might just keep him safe through the harshest winter he had ever known. But Samuel knew that the real test would come the next night, when the wolves would return. Would his trap work? Or would the pack prove to be even more cunning than he anticipated? Only time would tell. The snow was deeper than Samuel had expected. It clung to the trees and piled high on the ground, making every step feel like a battle against nature itself. He had walked the perimeter of his camp early that morning, checking the silent traps he'd set. The snares were still intact, the surrounding landscape undisturbed. But as the sun sank behind the mountain peaks, a fresh wave of anxiety took hold of him. The wolves would be close now, hunting in the darkness. Samuel sat by the fire, staring into the crackling flames as they flickered and danced. Wolf, his loyal dog, lay next to him, ears pricked and alert. The howls that had been so distant a few days ago now echoed through the trees, sharper and closer. Samuel's heart raced as he wondered how many were out there, waiting for their chance. He knew he had to remain patient, but it was becoming harder with each passing hour. As dusk fell, a deep silence spread across the camp. Wolf growled low in his throat, his body tensing. Samuel stood up slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, and stepped outside. The night was thick with snowflakes falling from the sky, muffling the world around him. But in the distance, he could hear the faintest sounds, footsteps crunching in the snow, a soft rustle as something moved just beyond the tree line. Then, the unmistakable sound of a wolf's howl pierced the quiet, sending a shiver down Samuel's spine. His trap was about to be tested. Samuel reached for his rifle, keeping his movements as slow and deliberate as possible. He moved toward the line of traps he had set near the ridge. The wolves had been circling since dusk, and now they were closing in. The first scent of his bait had drawn them near. He could feel the tension in his bones. This was no ordinary encounter. This wasn't just a test of his trap, it was a test of his survival. He reached the first snare, crouching low in the snow. It was set perfectly, just like he had planned, with nothing out of place. But the true test wasn't in the trap itself, it was in what would happen next. If the wolves didn't see the snare, it would work. If they did, it would be his last chance to adapt. The air was still as he waited. Every minute felt like an eternity. Then, in the dim light of the snow, he saw movement. One of the wolves, its body lithe and dark against the snow, approached cautiously. It sniffed the air, its yellow eyes glowing in the moonlight. Samuel held his breath, watching as it moved closer to the trap. The wolf's every step was calculated, every sense heightened by instinct. And then, it happened. The wolf stepped directly into the snare. The thin wire tightened in an instant, pulling the creature's leg up into the air, trapping it. A sharp yelp pierced the cold night, echoing through the trees. The trap had worked. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed forward, rifle in hand, and quickly dispatched the wolf. It wasn't the end, though. This was only the beginning. The pack would now know that something had changed. They would learn from the encounter, adapt, and likely return with a greater sense of caution. Samuel couldn't relax, not yet. But as he stood over the trapped wolf, a small smile tugged at his lips. His silent trap had passed the first test. His invention had worked. Samuel stood still, watching the body of the wolf sway gently in the snow, its form stark against the white ground. The trap had done its job, but the victory felt bittersweet. He had anticipated the trap's success, but what came next would be the real challenge. He knew the wolves weren't mindless creatures. They were intelligent, cunning, and adaptable. The next time they came, they would be wary. They would learn from their fallen comrade. He crouched down, carefully examining the wolf. Its fur was thick, a dense coat designed to withstand the harsh winters of the mountains. The creature had been a force to be reckoned with, strong and swift. But now, it was just another casualty in the fight for survival. Samuel paused to gather his thoughts, the cold biting at his skin. He had seen wolves stalk trappers before, circling with a quiet, dangerous patience. These wolves were not just animals, they were hunters. And if he underestimated them, his trap would no longer serve him. After a moment of reflection, Samuel decided to set another trap, even more refined than the first. He needed to stay one step ahead. He worked swiftly, moving with a precision born of experience. He repositioned his snares, creating new paths for the wolves to follow, adjusting the wire's tension, and laying fresh bait. By the time he finished, it was well into the night. The blizzard had begun to pick up again, snow swirling around his camp, making the world feel even more isolated. But the wolves were not deterred. Their calls echoed through the snow, drawing closer with each passing hour. As Samuel returned to the warmth of his cabin, he knew he couldn't rest yet. The pack would be back. But this time, they wouldn't fall for the same trap. They would learn from the scent of the last kill. They would be smarter, more patient. Samuel's heart raced with a new sense of urgency. He was beginning to realize that survival in the wilderness was never about staying one step ahead, it was about outlasting the wilderness itself. The howls from the pack grew louder, their sounds growing in intensity. Samuel sat by the fire, staring into the flames, as the wind howled louder outside. He had made his first move, but the wolves had their own strategies. The next few days would test everything Samuel had learned in his years alone in the wild. But one thing was certain, the game had only just begun, and Samuel was ready. Days passed, and Samuel's mind never strayed far from the wolves. The success of his silent trap was a small victory, but it had come at a cost. He knew the pack would return. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. The next attack would be different. The wolves had tasted failure, and with it, a new resolve. Samuel couldn't afford to relax. He spent each day reinforcing his traps and watching for signs of the pack. The howls were becoming more distant, but Samuel could sense they were closer than they appeared. Every step he took through the snow felt like a reminder of how vulnerable he was in this wilderness, one man against the forces of nature, with only his wits and ingenuity to rely on. The snow that had fallen in, heavy waves for days now lay still, a thick, frozen blanket over the land. The forest felt suffocating, the branches heavy with ice, the air thick with the weight of winter. Samuel's cabin stood in eerie silence, the warm glow from its windows offering little comfort as the outside world seemed to grow colder by the minute. Wolf, his dog, had become restless again. The usually calm animal now paced around the cabin, growling at the woods with growing intensity. Samuel knew this meant something, whether it was a wolf, a mountain lion, or something else. Wolf could sense danger before it arrived, and right now his behavior told Samuel the pack was closer than ever. The wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of wolves. Samuel's pulse quickened. They were here. The pack had circled back, and this time they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Samuel's breath fogged in the cold night air as he slowly stepped outside, rifle in hand. He had to be cautious. There was no telling how many wolves lurked in the dark beyond the cabin, and the last thing he wanted was to become a target. The first wolf appeared in the distance silent, a shadow against the snow. Samuel's breath caught in his chest. It moved with a predator's grace, eyes scanning the landscape, ears flicking in every direction. But it wasn't alone. More shapes emerged from the tree line, and Samuel counted at least 3 wolves, their eyes reflecting the dim light of the moon. Wolf growled low at Samuel's feet, his instincts sharp. Samuel reached down, placing a hand on the dog's head to calm him. His mind raced. He could wait for the wolves to move into the traps, but that was a risk. If they were smart, and they were one of them, would move around the perimeter, finding the snare before it could be triggered. He needed to act quickly. The wolves began to circle, testing the ground, sniffing the air. Samuel knew what they were doing. They were learning. The hunt was on, but they wouldn't fall for the same trick again. The first snare was only a few feet away from the wolves, hidden beneath a pile of snow. Samuel's heart thudded in his chest. If the wolves moved just a few inches more, they would be caught. But they were taking their time, wary, calculating their next move. Suddenly, the wind shifted again, and Samuel's stomach tightened. He could hear it now, the faintest sound of paws crunching through the snow, moving silently through the trees. There was something else out there, something Samuel hadn't anticipated. The real threat wasn't the wolves. It was the silence, the stillness that surrounded him. The wolves were testing his traps, but there was something else, lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of his rifle. The night was long, the wind biting through Samuel's heavy coat as he crouched low in the snow, his breath rising in foggy clouds. The wolves had disappeared back into the woods, retreating for now, but Samuel knew better than to think they were gone. The pack was watching. They would return, and when they did, they would be far more cautious. But Samuel's thoughts weren't entirely on the wolves anymore. The sound of something else moving in the distance had him on edge. His instincts told him it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Something was lurking, something that had moved with purpose, not like the wolves, but with a quiet calculation all its own. For hours, Samuel stayed in place, watching the woods, listening intently. Every crack of a branch or rustle of the snow made his heart race. His traps had been tested and worked, but they hadn't been the final solution. Not yet. The silent trap had been his best invention. A simple, quiet snare that could catch even the most elusive predator without making a sound. But now, Samuel realized the wilderness was full of unseen dangers, dangers that couldn't be trapped with a snare or a rifle. There were other predators out there, ones that didn't announce their arrival with howls or growls. The night dragged on, and as the hours ticked by, Samuel's body grew stiff with the cold. The fire inside the cabin had burned low, casting only faint shadows on the walls. Inside, Wolf lay by the hearth, eyes closed, but Samuel could tell that his dog's senses were still alert. He could feel the tension building. It was when the first light of dawn broke over the peaks that Samuel finally stood and stretched. He hadn't heard anything for hours, but something in the air had changed. The quiet stillness wasn't the same as before. The wolves had returned. Samuel moved cautiously, his rifle at the ready. He couldn't afford to make a sound. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped forward, the landscape before him nearly identical to the night before. But there was something different. The wolves were closer now, their tracks in the snow leading directly toward his cabin. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he saw the first shadow move across the snow. He was running out of time. The silent trap had worked, but now it was time for him to face the pack directly. He could no longer wait for the wolves to approach the traps. If he wanted to survive the wolf winter, he would need to think bigger, faster, and smarter. The test of patience had come, and Samuel knew that if he couldn't outwit the wolves this time, his fortress of solitude would be nothing but a tomb. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow-covered landscape. Samuel had spent the entire day preparing, his hands rough with the work, eyes constantly scanning the tree line for movement. The wolves had been circling, waiting, but they had learned to keep their distance more cautious than ever. The pack had felt his presence, and though they hadn't directly attacked since that first night, Samuel knew they were growing more desperate. The hunger of winter was gnawing at them. He could feel the weight of their eyes, even though he couldn't see them. Somewhere out there, a wolf watched, calculating its next move. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the wolves were no longer just hunting for food, they were hunting him. They had seen his traps, understood his methods, and now they were determined to test him. The night was coming on fast, and Samuel had one more piece to set in place. His silent traps had proven effective, but they weren't foolproof. He couldn't afford to be complacent. He needed to be ready for whatever the pack would throw at him. Samuel moved swiftly through the snow, retracing his steps from the previous day to check his snares. He had worked tirelessly to perfect them, setting them in places where the wolves were most likely to pass. The cold air nipped at his skin as he inspected each snare, ensuring everything was in place. His dog Wolf followed silently at his side, ever alert, his eyes scanning the woods. "Stay close, boy," Samuel murmured. He could feel the tension building, the air growing heavier with every passing minute. As he finished his rounds, Samuel looked up at the sky. The snow had begun to fall again, gently this time, but enough to mask any movement. The wolves were out there, hiding in the snow, watching from the cover of trees. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. It was then that he heard a soft, distant howl that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The wolves were closing in. Samuel's grip tightened on his rifle as he turned and made his way back to the cabin, knowing that the time for hiding was over. The pack was coming. Inside, he stoked the fire to life, the warm glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. Wolf curled up near the hearth, his eyes never straying far from the door. Samuel was aware of every sound, every shift in the wind. The wolves were getting closer, and they were smarter now, more deliberate. The first attack had been a test, and they had learned from it. Samuel moved to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtain just enough to peek outside. The snow was falling harder now, but through the blur of falling flakes, he could see shapes moving in the distance, dark, ghostly figures, circling in a slow, methodical pattern. They were coming for him. With a deep breath, Samuel stepped back from the window and quietly moved to the door. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, the knowledge that whatever happened next would be the ultimate test of his ingenuity, his survival, and his ability to outsmart the wilderness itself. The wolves were no longer just predators. They were adversaries, and Samuel had only one option: to survive. He stepped outside, knowing full well that the battle had begun. The wolves were closing in. Samuel could feel their presence, a weight that pressed on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He had prepared for this moment, but no amount of preparation could fully steel a man's nerves when the stakes were so high. The wolves were smarter than ever, and Samuel knew that if he wasn't careful, they would slip through his traps like shadows in the night. He had to outsmart them. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about proving that his ingenuity could beat nature's raw force. He had spent years in the wilderness, living on his wits and learning the ways of the land, but this was a new kind of test. The wolves were relentless, and they weren't going to give up easily. Samuel's heart raced as he crouched low, moving as silently as possible through the snow. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and his hand rested on the hilt of his knife, ready for anything. He moved toward the clearing where he had set the majority of his traps, making sure to check each one carefully. The pack was close, now he could hear them, their low growls and the crunch of snow underfoot. Wolf, ever alert, stood beside him, his fur bristling. The dog's keen senses had picked up on the wolves' movements long before Samuel had. The two of them, together, were a team forged in the harshest conditions. But this time, Samuel wasn't just depending on his traps to keep him safe. He had one more trick up his sleeve, a plan that he hoped would be the final, silent blow. The wolves had come to rely on their cunning, and now it was time to turn the tables on them. He moved to the far side of his camp, to a small hill that overlooked the traps. It gave him a perfect vantage point, and he could see the wolves moving closer, circling around the clearing. The pack was tight-knit, each wolf watching the other's backs, as though they were expecting something to happen. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared to make his move. The first wolf stepped into the clearing, its eyes scanning the area for danger. It was big, a strong creature with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. But it wasn't looking for the trap, it was looking for Samuel. The moment the wolf stepped too close, Samuel pulled the rope hidden under the snow, and the snare tightened around its leg. The wolf yelped in surprise, but it didn't struggle. Instead, it let out a low growl and looked around, as though it knew the game was up. Samuel's pulse quickened as the other wolves paused, their instincts telling them to retreat, to reconsider. But the trap had worked. The snare had caught the wolf without warning, and it couldn't break free. The other wolves watched in stunned silence as Samuel moved swiftly, quietly, to approach the trapped creature. He could feel their eyes on him, studying him from the shadows. It was over. Samuel had won. He hadn't fired a single shot. He hadn't made a sound. He had used their own cleverness against them, and it had worked. As he stood over the wolf, his heart still racing, he realized that survival wasn't always about brute strength or firepower. Sometimes, it was about patience, wit, and knowing when to let the wilderness work in your favor. The wolves slowly retreated into the forest, their howls fading into the distance. Samuel stood alone in the clearing, his breath fogging in the cold air. Wolf walked beside him, nuzzling his hand. The battle had been won, but the war against the wilderness, against the pack, was far from over. The wind had shifted overnight, and a quiet calm had settled over the mountains. The snow that had fallen relentlessly for days was now just a soft powder, coating every branch and every crevice, creating an eerie stillness. Samuel stood by the cabin, staring out across the frozen landscape. The wolves had retreated for now, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. Their hunger hadn't disappeared, and their patience was something Samuel had learned to respect. As the days passed, the pack kept its distance, their movements calculated, their attacks avoided. The first wave had been a test, and Samuel's traps had proven their worth. But now, it was a waiting game. The pack was still out there, moving between the trees, just beyond his sight. He could feel their presence, their eyes constantly watching, calculating their next move. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The weeks seemed to drag on, each day stretching longer as the tension between predator and prey grew thicker. Samuel had spent days reinforcing his traps, ensuring that the silent snare system would continue to work even as the wolves adapted. He had learned much from the first encounter. They were quick to notice changes, quick to adapt, and even quicker to recognize when they were being tricked. But Samuel was no stranger to the wilderness. He knew that survival wasn't just about outsmarting the animals, it was about knowing the land, understanding the rhythms of nature, and being able to predict the movements of every creature. The wolves would return, and when they did, Samuel would be ready. One morning, as he checked his traps, he noticed something strange. The snow was disturbed near the edge of his camp, as though something or someone had been there recently. Samuel crouched down, running his fingers through the snow. There, beneath the surface, he could see the distinct shape of a paw print. But it wasn't from a wolf. This was something different, something larger. His heart skipped a beat as he realized what it meant. A bear. The sudden realization hit him like a cold wave. The wolves had been relentless, but now a new threat had appeared. A bear, likely searching for food, had moved into the area, drawn by the scent of his traps and the carcasses of the wolves he had caught. It wasn't uncommon for bears to scavenge during the winter months, but this was different. This bear had been too close to the camp. Samuel cursed under his breath. His traps were effective against wolves, but a bear was a different kind of enemy. It wasn't about outsmarting it. It was about survival. As he stood in the snow, the wind howling around him, Samuel realized that the wilderness had changed once again. The delicate balance of survival that he had fought so hard to maintain had shifted. The wolves had been his greatest threat, but now they were no longer his only concern. The wilderness had a way of throwing new challenges at him, always testing his limits. Samuel had survived the wolf winter, but now he faced a new predator, one that was bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than anything he had encountered before. And this time, there would be no silence to hide behind. The bear's tracks led Samuel deep into the forest, where the snow was thinner and the trees stood tall and unyielding. He followed the path cautiously, keeping to the shadows, his rifle at the ready. The wilderness had a way of testing a man, pushing him to the edge of his abilities. Samuel had learned this lesson time and again, and now, as he walked toward the heart of the forest, he knew that the true test of his survival skills was only beginning. He had built his cabin, his silent traps, his methods of survival, all of it with one goal in mind: to outlast the dangers of the wild. But as the bear's tracks grew fresher and more prominent, Samuel realized that his time in the wilderness was drawing to an end. He had survived the wolves, but nature had a way of shifting, of changing the rules just when a man thought he had mastered it all. The forest was quiet now, the sounds of the wolves long gone. The only noise was the crunch of snow under his boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. Samuel stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath, his senses alert. He could feel the presence of the bear. Its scent was strong now, the air thick with it. The tracks led him deeper, toward a clearing, where he could see the faint outlines of a den. Samuel crouched low, heart pounding in his chest. He had survived many winters in the wild, faced countless dangers, but nothing quite like this. The bear was a different kind of predator, one that didn't hesitate, didn't wait. It would strike when least expected. As he approached the den, Samuel knew that this was it. The bear would either attack or it would retreat. There was no room for hesitation now. He had to act. He steadied his rifle, taking aim, his breath shallow in the cold air. The bear's form emerged from the den, its massive shape dark against the white snow. It moved with power, each step deliberate, as though it could sense Samuel's presence. The creature's eyes met his, and for a moment, the two stared at each other, man and beast, locked in a silent standoff. In that moment, Samuel realized something important. The wilderness wasn't about conquering the land or its creatures, it was about respecting them. It was about understanding that survival was a delicate balance, one that had to be maintained, not by brute force, but by knowing when to fight, and when to let go. The bear, sensing no immediate threat, turned and disappeared into the trees, its massive form fading into the wilderness. Samuel lowered his rifle slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. The danger had passed, but the lesson remained. He had survived the wolf winter. He had outwitted the wolves, built a cabin that could withstand their attacks, and adapted to every challenge the wilderness had thrown at him. But in the end, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about understanding that the wilderness was not something to be conquered, but something to be respected. Samuel stood there for a long time, the cold wind biting at his skin, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had been tested over and over by the elements, the creatures, and the harsh realities of frontier life. But he had come through it all, stronger and wiser. As he turned back toward his cabin, the mountains standing tall in the distance, Samuel knew that his legacy in the wilderness would live on. The wolves would tell their stories, the bears would roam free, and his cabin would stand as a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of a man who had learned to survive the most unforgiving land on earth. Samuel's story would live on, not in books or legends, but in the very landscape that had shaped him. It was a story of survival, of respect for the land, and of knowing that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from conquering the wilderness, but from living in harmony with it.